Previously on BR Rock.
Here is an entire argument. Premise 1. If Hillary Clinton is a Martian, then she is a professional basketball player. Premise 2. Hillary Clinton is a Martian. Conclusion. Therefore, she is a professional basketball player. Does anybody out there know which sentence in this argument is a conditional sentence? That's right, it's premise 1, because it's an if-then sentence. And remember what we learned in the previous video.
Oh, if the antecedent's true and the consequent is false, then I'm false. I'm true in all other cases. Oh, if the antecedent's true and the consequent is false, then I'm false. I'm true in all other cases. And that's the way it is.
Let's go back now to the case of if it rains, then we get wet. All right, folks, there's been a lot of action on the field today. Now you see P equals it rains and Q equals we get wet. Here's the case where it's true that it rains and we see it's true that we get wet. So in that case, it's true that if it rains, then we get wet. All right, let's go down to the second row. Here it's true that it rains, but false that we get wet. What are the judges going to rule? Oh, that's the one case where it's false, that if it rains, then we get wet. Okay, here we go. Here's the case where it's false that it rains, but true that we get wet. We get wet some other way. Friends come by and hit us with water balloons. In that case, it's still true that if it rains, then we get wet. And last but not least, here's the case where it's false that it rains and false that we get wet. It's still true that if it rains, then we get wet. He shoots, he scores. At this point, you may be wondering, why would false true give true, and why would false false give true? Well, here is the truth of the matter. You believe you have an intuitive understanding of what those if-then sentences mean, but your intuitions are wrong. You're like the airplane pilot who thinks that if he drops the bomb directly over the barn, it will blow up the barn, when in fact he should drop the bomb a little bit before he gets to the barn, because the bomb's going to be traveling at the same speed the airplane. So you're like that. It's called error theory, right? Is it error attribution theory? I don't know, but anyway, you're wrong. The truth of the matter is that logic knows what those if-then sentences mean better than we know. Now, here's the short version for now. Maybe I'll come back to this later, but if we did it the way we intuitively think is right for those if-then sentences, the difference between good arguments and bad arguments would collapse. So all of logic would fall apart. You would be unable to distinguish a good argument from a bad argument, because some arguments that are valid would come out invalid by that method, and other arguments that are invalid would come out valid by that method. So we have to do it that way. Just remember, true false gives false under the sign of the if-then. True false gives false. True in all other cases is like the song says, right? Now let's see. There's one more thing. Oh yes, there's one example that really helps to keep it in mind. It's the one, if we think about promises it just seems to go down a little smoother. It's not quite such a jagged little pill. So Wilma and Sherb have gone on a few dates, but Sherb just seems a little bit too clingy, so Wilma has dumped him. But she's got a good heart, so she tells Sherb when they go over to Kirkwood, "If it rains, then I will give you a ride home." Now, the way to think about the if-then sentences is to think about this case and ask, under what conditions does Wilma break her promise? So, let P be, it rains, and Q be, I give you a ride home. And we're back in the second quarter. Here is the case where it's true that it rains, and it's true that Wilma gives Sherb a ride home. Did she break her promise? No, she kept her promise. And now we move to the next row. Here's the case where it's true that it rains, but it's false that Wilma gives Sherb a ride home. Did she break her promise? Yes, that is the one case, folks, where she broke her promise. Now we move to the third row. Here's the case where it's false that it rains, but it's true she gives him a ride home anyway. Maybe she's sending mixed signals, but she did not break her promise. Still true. And last but not least, folks, here is the case where it's false that it rains, and it's false that she gives him a ride home. She still kept her promise. She didn't break her promise. Do 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 do. Wonder what the name of that song is. That's like a baseball song. Was that in the Joker? I don't know. Well, anyway, what have we learned? Well, remember, the if-then sentence is only false if the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. Otherwise, the if-then sentence is true. Also, Wilma only promised Sherb that if it rains, then she'll give him a ride home. That doesn't apply to the case where it doesn't rain, where it's false that it rains. So the promise stays intact so long as the condition of rain doesn't come about. She can't break the promise unless it rains, see? So that's why false gives a true and false true gives a true. It's because the promise doesn't kick in unless it actually rains. Then she either keeps the promise or breaks the promise. Well, it's 1:25, so I'm going to go to bed now. I'm getting tired. I kind of burned the midnight oil doing this. But anyway, this is Chris McCord, Professor of Philosophy at Kirkwood Community College. And this is Basic Reasoning Rock. Good night, everybody.
Oh, if the antecedent's true and the consequent is false, then I'm false.